Thank you, sir. So now we'll move on to block 3 of this webinar, where we're going to just do a quick intro, right, to stability assessment framework. We're going to go through all 4 components, but I'm calling it an intro because there's a lot more to it than what you're going to see. So these are kind of wave tops. And then once again, the focus and the reason for showing stability assessment framework is so that you can see how the U.S. Marine Corps utilizes ASCOPE-PMESII, because we already clearly identified ASCOPE-PMESII being a tool that we use to organize civil environment information. And so now stability assessment framework is another analytical process in which we pull from that ASCOPE-PMESII matrix, and we use that to help us then later on do some analysis. Next slide, please. So what is stability assessment framework, also commonly referred to as SAF? It's an approach to help understand those stability dynamics in that civil environment. SAF, it's not a standalone product. It's most definitely a tool that supports CPB. So here you can clearly see that it acknowledges CPB as a separate process. And it also supports the efforts of military or Marine Corps operations and the targeting process. It is also what civil affairs Marines should understand or should use so that they can understand those stability dynamics in order to be able to support their commander's decision making. Because we don't do civil affairs just for the sake of doing civil affairs. The whole point is to be able to help that commander make a more informed decision with those civil considerations. SAF also reinforces the resiliencies that we discussed in CPB, and it also addresses causes of instability also initially discussed within CPB. Next slide, please. All right, go ahead, one more click, please. All right, so stability assessment framework. It is broken down into 4 basic components, right? With that first one being the CPB, which we already did, right? Then we do even more analysis that's very specifically focused on stability assessment. And then there's a design aspect to it, the 3rd component, and that 4th component is execution. One more click, please. There we go. So then here you can see specifically within each of those 4 components, we are looking at very specific things. So component number 1, this is where you're going to look at your civil considerations, you know, your culture dynamics, your instability factors, which is, as you know, because you just saw it, that is exactly what we looked at initially within CPB. Then in component 2, we will look at analysis through stability analysis, and then we have a specific stability worksheet. We call it part 1 that we look at. Then for design, we have 4 parts: activity design, that COA development. Then we got stability worksheet, the 2nd part. And then we do civil reconnaissance, the actual act of conducting civil reconnaissance out in the field. And then execution is that 4th component, where we then influence the targeting cycle by submitting non-lethal target nominations. And then we start our assessment by monitoring and evaluating, and then we do transition. So this right here kind of just is a quick overview and summary of what the whole process looks like. Now let's get more into detail. Next slide, please. All right, so component number 1, as we discussed, you look at civil considerations, culture dynamics, and instability through the CPB process. Next slide. The purpose of component 1 is to achieve a heightened understanding of that battle space. And you do that by firstly understanding the overall operating environment using ASCOPE-PMESII, right, those civil considerations, understanding cultural dynamics. You specifically look at those 5 dimensions. And then number 3, understanding of instability and stability dynamics, which specifically is looking at those resiliencies and the grievances and comparing them to each other. Next slide, please. So what is cultural factor analysis? So what are we doing? We're taking abstract and intangible concepts of that culture, and we're determining the nature and scope of its impact. So culture, we defined previously as a shared worldview and social structures of a group of people that influences a person's or a group's actions and choices. Cultural factors, as we also mentioned, they can be key influences in a civil environment or in that operational area. And just a refresher again, they could be individuals, groups, assets, infrastructure, and social cultural belief sets of factors which could have a significant influence on the friendly mission accomplishment, which is why, as a military person, we care, and they should be considered in operational planning and execution, not just individuals. It's not just individuals doing this, or it's not just people to look at. It's a lot more things that could be key influences. Next slide, please. So to answer the question earlier, so cultural factors, when we look at cultural factors, we're specifically looking at those cultural dimensions, right? So the 5 cultural dimensions. Here you can see on the left is a front cover of a Marine Corps publication called Operational Culture for the Warfighter, in which it discusses the 5 dimensions of operational culture. And you can use this as a tool to help you organize cultural factor analysis. Because in there, you look at the ecological part, the social structure, and the symbolic structure, right? So for ecological model, you have that first dimension talking about that physical environment, and the second dimension talking about the economy. Your social structure model, it has the 3rd and 4th dimensions where you talk about social structure and the political structure. And then your symbolic model, it touches on that 5th dimension on beliefs and symbols. Next slide, please. So CMO planners, they should apply cultural perspective. They need to take or cultural perspective taking and cultural interpretation to the information gathered. Once again, you do this because when you do it, you got to try and look at it from a different perspective. And we don't realize sometimes when we're looking at another culture, we're comparing it to our own or seeing how it's just like ours, or we make very quick assumptions, meaning we mirror our culture and say, oh yeah, well, they're just like us, or they think like this because we think like this. So you got to try and minimize that tendency of mirroring your own culture when you're conducting cultural factors analysis. Consider the questions posed in Appendix B of this publication. So Appendix B has very specific questions, and I'd have to check and see if we have electronic versions of it, but I do know that the Operational Culture for the Warfighter book is still available. And I believe the 2nd edition is the last one, but it should still have that Appendix B with the questions. So results of this analysis should be included in that civil factors and relevance matrix that you already filled out during the analysis phase, step 2 of CPB. So here you can see like how everything is pretty much interconnected. And if you already do the work, it helps these further on analytical process. You do your ASCOPE PMESII. I mean, it's a continuous process, right? But you do that, and that directly influences the CPB, and CPB directly influences, this part of the SAF process. Next slide, please. So here we have, once again, the instability and stability factors matrix. These are the same ones that we saw earlier, but the reason for me bringing them up here is so that you can see where they fit into this very specific stability assessment framework. And this is where we're looking at those grievances and resiliencies in that civil population and then doing some analysis so we can derive the key influences, means, and motivations for each. Next slide, please. All right, so component number 2, analysis. We do stability analysis, and then we do the first part of the stability worksheet. Next slide, please. The purpose is to narrow relevant factors to a lesser number of issues that are indeed actual sources of instability or stability. And you do this by employing a tactical form of root cause analysis to examine symptom-cause relationships. So you do this via research and also through the tactical questions, TCS questions. Utilizing a stability or sources of instability and stability analysis matrix, it examines 3 instability criteria to ascertain priority grievances and resiliencies. So this is how you are able to prioritize those grievances and resiliencies. Next slide, please. All right, so now we move on to the 3rd component, which is design. That's composed, once again, of your activity design, your COA development, the second part of that stability worksheet, and then the civil recon. Next slide, please. And you do this so that CMO planners can design, prioritize, and then synchronize the stabilization activities by completing these two specific products. So by completing the activity design worksheet and then the design section of the instability stability matrix part 2, then you're able to design, prioritize, and synchronize your stabilization activities. Potential activities are then screened and refined using 3 stability criteria. Now, because of time restrictions, I actually removed these worksheets, but we do have a pamphlet that I can definitely share with everyone later on that will let you see what these matrices look like, the part 1 and part 2 that we're mentioning. Next slide, please. All right, and finally, component number 4, execution. Non-lethal targeting packages, monitoring, and then transition. Next slide, please. And this phase consists of your nominating non-lethal targeting packages to operating department. Super important because this is how you maintain relevance. Intertwining yourself and syncing yourself up with those targeting working groups, ensuring that that all the lethal professionals know about targets that are non-lethal and probably shouldn't be struck. Very important to be fully involved with that on the staff. You're monitoring and evaluating your effects in that environment, and then you're also able to transition to competent authorities eventually, event-driven, or conduct closing actions at the conclusion of operations, which is time-driven. Next slide, please. All right, so that is a very quick discussion of an analytical process that uses ASCOPE PMESII, because as we started off earlier today, we showed that the Marine Corps uses ASCOPE PMESII to collect information, to bin it as we start looking at the civil environment. And then once we have as much information, and it's all determined by how much time we have, then we can use that to start our civil preparation of the Battlespace process, and we use ASCOPE PMESII in that step 1. We can also use the ASCOPE PMESII information we gathered along with the outputs of civil preparation of the Battlespace to influence our stability assessment framework when we're looking at those factors of stability and instability in an area. But once again, the bottom line is, ASCOPE PMESII for us right now in the Marine Corps is an information gathering and organizational tool so that we can then easily refer to things when we're doing our analytical processes with CPB and SAF. So at this time, that concludes the overall presentation, and I am open for any questions or comments that any of you may have. Over.